Mm, Hey, hey. He is my cat, so he's a bit, he's just woken up, so he's a bit like unwilling. Okay, here you go, here you go. Alright. Right. If not, we're going to go on to the next part of our lesson and we're going to talk about evidence. So I hope you had some time to read the essay that I wrote for you guys. Okay, no lah, it's not an essay, it's more of a paragraph. So I hope you had some time to read through it, and later on there'll be a short MCQ section testing your knowledge. Testing you about what you understood from this. So let's go through this one at a time. Okay. So if you recall previously, right, we asked the question about this passage was, what is your impression of tips? Okay. So when we write our point, okay, we always write our point at the beginning. So you notice what's highlighted so far is Tips is a patient butler who treats George with politeness and respect out of deference to his position as the master of the house. Meaning to say, like he knows he treats him with respect because he knows that he is the servant and George is the master. Okay. However, he cannot help feeling disgust towards George. So this is our point, and it always begins right at the beginning of the paragraph, and it must answer the question directly. Remember, your point always answers the question. Next, when you read the paragraph that I wrote for you guys, you should note that the evidence is all given out to you. So for example, right, I tell you that Tips points out that George has been serving the wrong kind of wine. That's a piece of evidence, right? That's what he does. That's an action that he did. That's an action that Tips did. And he also addresses George as Sir. That's also an action that those are words that he used. He also warns George not to be offended by his advice. Again, that's an action that he did. He refers to his own advice as a small suggestion, right? Those are words that he uses. He also deliberately uses the adjectives cheap and odious to describe the wine, and in the process, he also subconsciously insults George as well. So these are words that he uses. And lastly, when he speaks to George, he inclined his head to one side and looked at the ceiling. So that's also a kind of evidence that is given. That's evidence of his actions. Okay. So when we write a paragraph, our evidence will take center stage, and our evidence, we must always have more than one piece of evidence. In an examination, if you can't find more than one, perhaps that means that your point is wrong, and you need to rethink again what your point should be. Okay, remember, evidence is always the most important thing. No evidence, no need to write the point already. Okay. After writing the evidence, okay, you must make sure that your evidence is quoted and not lifted. This means that whenever we talk about evidence that is given, okay, we try not to copy out wholesale extracts from the passage. It's very tempting, especially in your exam and you're running out of time, but you find that you're repeating exactly what the passage said, then you're not really giving evidence, you're just telling me the story. Okay, and if you the best way to do this is, of course, to quote. And when you quote, right, please remember to use the double quotation marks. These double quotation marks show that you are telling me something, a word that is said inside the passage. Okay, please remember, use these double quotation marks. If you don't use the double quotation marks, you are basically pretending to pass off something that was given to you as something that you wrote yourself, and that's wrong. Okay, if I see that in an essay, it means I understand immediately, right, that you have not made an attempt to be precise in quoting evidence. So that is a bad thing for you, right? That affects your grade very badly. Okay. Next, when you give evidence, right, please remember that only short quotes are used. This will be the same as what I pointed out in a previous lesson. I said, right, that short quotes in a comprehension mean that only less than seven words or less. So likewise, right, when you quote from a passage, please make sure that you quote 7 words or less. Okay, and the quotes are all woven in directly. Right, you will notice, right, I put them directly into the sentences like this, okay, so that they flow seamlessly. Right? For example, I said he inclined his head to one side and looked at the ceiling. So basically, like when I quote like this, I ignore all the unnecessary words that don't prove my point. And this helps your reader to focus on your evidence. Next, when we talk about evidence, right, we also want to give the type of evidence, and we want to use our knowledge of literature to show that to explain what is going on. So we always identify the technique that's being used. For example, if a character uses sarcasm, be sure to point it out. If if you are focusing on a character's actions, be sure to point it out as well. If you're focusing on his behavior, be sure to point it out. And if you're talking about his tone of voice when he talks to another character, be sure to use the word tone as well. Okay. Next, if you're going to give me evidence, right, as far as possible, try to tell me the type of evidence, and remember that we talked about indirect characterization. So if you're telling me about the setting of the story, please use the word setting. If you're telling me about the character's appearance, please use the word appearance. You will recall in The Hitchhiker, we talked about the hitchhiker's appearance, that he looks like a beggar and he has mysterious large pockets. Those are examples of a character's appearance. Okay. If the writer focuses on the character's thoughts, then be sure to mention that these are the thoughts of the character. Okay. So this was on an earlier slide. Please be sure to keep this in mind. Next, when we talk about evidence of a character's actions and behavior, we summarize instead of lifting using reported speech. Okay, so reported speech is very different, right? We summarize, okay, like we use these verbs that tell us more about what the character's intentions are. So we don't say that he says that George should not be offended by his advice, but we say that Tibbs warns George not to be offended, or when he points out that George has been serving the wrong kind of wine, or he criticizes George for serving the wrong kind of wine, or he explains that George has been serving the wrong kind of wine. You're actually telling me what the character's intentions are. Okay, so this is an example of reported speech. Please use it when you are writing your essays. Yeah. So for example, right, when the part where Tibbs warns George not to be offended comes from this section where he says, "I hope, sir, you will not be offended." You see this? So we take out this part and then we transform it into reported speech. Just as this part where Tibbs says, "Good food should be accompanied by superb wine, but you serve them a cheap and very odious Spanish red." So we focus on this part here, that he's been serving them the wrong wine, and then we say that he points out that George has been serving the wrong kind of wine. Remember, right? This is not lifted at all. It's paraphrased. It's summarized very succinctly, very shortly, and very accurately. Okay. Next, when we want to give an explanation, right? When you give an explanation to me as a student in your essays, I need to see that that's an explanation. So when you write your explanations, be sure to use these phrases. For example, after you tell me the evidence, right, you tell me this shows XXX, or this shows XXX, that Tibbs is humble, or you tell me that the sarcasm in his voice implies, okay, that he might not just be talking about wine, but George's lack of class as well. Implies, right? This implies that Tibbs looks down on George, or his actions suggest that he is embarrassed. This implies that while he is disgusted by George, he's too afraid to tell him that. This implies, this shows, this suggests. So when you give me an explanation, please remember to use these words so that I know that what you're saying is an explanation and it's not evidence, right? Next, when you talk about, okay, I also asked you to give explanations, right? So I told you that explanations are very often based on the character's intentions. And in this case, since our point is about Tibbs who is patient, our explanations must show that his intentions show that he is patient. Okay, so we are always looking at a character's feelings, their beliefs, and their relationships to the other characters. So, for example, Tibbs behaves courteously because he shows empathy. He considers George's feelings. He's motivated by his feelings. He shows respect out of consideration, out of feelings. And when he thinks that George lacks class, that's actually a belief, right? He believes that George has no class. When we say that he is embarrassed by George's lack of class, that's a feeling. And he is disgusted by George, but is too afraid to tell him directly about the problem. This really tells us, I know it says afraid, right? But this really tells us about the relationship between George and Tibbs. So this is his relationship to other characters. So be sure to keep this in mind when you write your explanations. This will help you to think of ways to explain evidence. If not, right now I'm gonna stop this video, and then I want you to go through the next activity, and you need to identify. You will need to refer to this paragraph that has been written. I want you to identify whether the sentences that were given right now, what kind of sentences are they? Are they points? Are they evidence, or are they explanations? Do we talk about a character's feelings, beliefs, or their relationships? So I hope you complete that activity, and if not, right, we'll go on to the next section, which will be the final section.